When the Ford Falcon first made its appearance in 1960, it arrived at a time when the American automotive landscape was shifting in a way few could have predicted. The post-war boom years have been defined by chrome, tailfins, and enormous engines, but by the late 1950s, the winds of change were blowing through Detroit. Economic recessions, rising fuel prices, and the influx of small, efficient European imports, like the Volkswagen Beetle, Renault Dauphine, and Fiat 600, had begun to challenge America's long-standing obsession with size and excess. Consumers were starting to look for practicality and thrift rather than pure extravagance. Ford Motor Company, which had enjoyed great success with large cars like the Galaxy and Fairlane, realized it needed to rethink its strategy. In an era of tailfins and two-ton cruisers, the idea of a small, affordable, fuel-efficient Ford almost seemed radical. Yet, that was precisely what the market demanded. The Falcon was conceived not as a flashy novelty, but as a necessity. Ford's answer to America's growing appetite for smaller cars that made sense for everyday life. Behind the Falcon's creation was a blend of practicality and ambition. The car's development began in 1957 under the guidance of Robert S. McNamara, a man whose pragmatic, numbers-driven mindset would later earn him a position as Secretary of Defense. McNamara believed in efficiency above all else, both in production and in purpose. He saw the opportunity to design a car that would appeal to the average family, something affordable, easy to maintain, reliable, and, most importantly, economical. This philosophy defined every decision in the Falcon's development. The engineers stripped away anything unnecessary, focusing instead on lightweight, mechanical simplicity, and a user-friendly driving experience. The result was a car that was refreshingly straightforward. The Falcon used a unibody construction to reduce weight, a relatively new concept for Ford at the time, and it came with a modest 144 cubic inch inline-six engine that produced 90 horsepower, just enough to move the car efficiently without wasting fuel. It wasn't glamorous, but that was the point. It was honest transportation, a return to automotive basics at a time when the market desperately needed it. When the Falcon finally reached showrooms in the fall of 1959 for the 1960 model year, it was marketed as the new size Ford. The advertisement spoke directly to middle-class families who wanted something practical but still modern. It was roomy enough for a family of five, yet small enough to park easily in crowded suburban driveways or city streets. Ford priced it aggressively, starting at around $1,900, making it one of the most affordable cars on the market. It offered more space and comfort than foreign competitors, but consumed far less fuel than the full-size Fords that dominated the company's lineup. Dealers reported enthusiastic responses from buyers who were tired of the over-styled, gas-guzzling cars of the previous decade. The Falcon sales reflected this pent-up demand. In its first year alone, Ford sold more than 435,000 Falcons, and by the end of 1961, that number had surged past 900,000. It became the best-selling compact car in America, outpacing the Chevrolet Corvair and the Rambler American, and giving Ford the strong foothold it needed in this newly emerging segment. Part of what made the Falcon so successful was its straightforwardness. Everything about it was designed to be easy to drive, easy to fix, easy to afford. The steering was light, the controls were simple, and the cabin, though minimal, felt open and functional. There was nothing intimidating or pretentious about it. It appealed to families buying their first new car, to older buyers downsizing from large models, and even to women drivers who appreciated its manageable size and smooth handling. Ford's marketing department cleverly positioned the Falcon as the car for sensible people, and that message resonated deeply in an economy still recovering from recession. It was reliable transportation for everyday Americans, teachers, office workers, young couples starting families. It represented not just mobility, but stability, the idea that owning a car didn't have to mean extravagance. In that sense, the Falcon perfectly captured the spirit of its time. Mechanically, the Falcon wasn't groundbreaking, but it was cleverly engineered for its purpose. Its six-cylinder engine was efficient and durable, and Ford made sure replacement parts were inexpensive and widely available. The unibody construction provided a smooth ride and good fuel economy, while cutting down on production costs. The car's simple 3-speed manual transmission and optional 2-speed Ford-O-Matic automatic was dependable and familiar. The The Falcon could easily reach 25 miles per gallon, an impressive figure for an American car of the era. Its reliability became one of its strongest selling points, with countless families driving their Falcons well past 100,000 miles, a rarity in those days. Mechanics loved it too. Its simplicity meant it was easy to service, a characteristic that further cemented its popularity in small towns and suburbs alike. The Falcon was, in many ways, the everyman's car, one that quietly did its job without demanding attention or admiration. Even though it was designed to be utilitarian, the Falcon wasn't entirely devoid of style. Its design, led by Ford stylist Joe Orris, featured clean, balanced lines that reflected restraint rather than flamboyance. The car's face was friendly but purposeful, with a simple grille and round headlights that gave it an approachable character. It didn't scream for attention. It looked confident in its modesty. Inside, the dashboard was straightforward and uncluttered, reflecting the minimalist trend of the new decade. Buyers could choose from a range of body styles, including two-door and four-door sedans, wagons, and later, a coupe and convertible, allowing families to pick the Falcon that best fit their needs. This versatility contributed greatly to its success, giving Ford a car that appealed to a wide cross-section of America. By the early 1960s, the Ford Falcon had achieved what few cars manage. It changed how an entire generation thought about small cars. It proved that a compact vehicle didn't have to feel cheap or compromised, that less could, in fact, mean smarter. Ford had not only tapped into a market trend, but had defined it. Yet, ironically, the Falcon's greatest legacy would not come from its own success, but from what it inspired next. The same lightweight platform that made the Falcon so practical would soon serve as the foundation for the car that defined the 1960s, the Ford Mustang. In a twist of fate, the Falcon's simplicity and engineering efficiency laid the groundwork for a cultural icon that would overshadow it completely. But in that first chapter of his life, before the Mustang mania, before the changing tides of the market, the Falcon stood as a symbol of sensible innovation. It was Ford's quiet triumph, a car that reminded America that sometimes, by the early 1960s, the Ford Falcon was already a proven success. It had given Ford exactly what it needed: a strong foothold in the compact market, reliable sales figures, and a solid engineering foundation to build upon. But inside Ford's headquarters, a new energy was stirring. The company wasn't content with practicality alone. It wanted excitement. The post-war generation was coming of age, and a new wave of young buyers was emerging. People who didn't just want transportation, but freedom, style, and individuality. The Falcon had proven that Americans were ready to downsize, but Ford executives saw an opportunity to transform that practicality into passion. This was the genesis of one of the most legendary decisions in automotive history. Lee Iacocca, then a young and ambitious executive at Ford, recognized that the Falcon's lightweight, affordable platform could serve as the perfect foundation for something entirely different: a sporty, youthful, yet attainable car that would redefine what Americans thought a small car could be. That car would become the Ford Mustang, and in doing so, it would both immortalize and overshadow the Falcon forever. The transition from Falcon to Mustang wasn't immediate, but it was deliberate. Ford's engineers had spent years refining the Falcon's chassis, drivetrain, and suspension systems. It was cost-effective, reliable, and already proven in millions of miles of everyday use. That made it the perfect candidate for adaptation. Iacocca's vision was to use what Ford already had, a dependable, inexpensive platform, and build a car that captured the spirit of youth. This approach kept development costs low, something critical at a time when Ford's finances were still recovering from past missteps. The Mustang's basic underpinnings, its frame, suspension components, and powertrain options, were all derived directly from Falcon. In essence, the Mustang was born from the Falcon's bones. Ford's decision to reuse those parts wasn't just practical, it was brilliant. It meant that the Mustang could be priced competitively, manufactured quickly, and sold profitably from the very start. The Falcon, though never designed to be glamorous, had unwittingly provided the blueprint for one of the most glamorous cars of the century. When the Mustang debuted in April 1964, it was unlike anything Ford or any other automaker had ever released. The response was electric. Crowds flooded dealerships, and Ford sold over 22,000 Mustangs on the first day alone. Within a year, more than 400,000 were on the road. The car's success was meteoric, and in that success, the Falcon's shadow grew longer. For years, the Falcon had been Ford's small car darling, but overnight, it looked dated. Buyers who had once been drawn to the Falcon's sensible practicality were now swept away by the Mustang's emotional appeal. The Mustang represented excitement, freedom, and rebellion, qualities the Falcon had never claimed to embody. Ford's marketing machine, which had once touted the Falcon as a new-size Ford, now poured its energy into selling a dream, not just a car. And in doing so, the Falcon's identity began to fade. It wasn't that the Falcon suddenly became a bad car. It simply lost its reason for being. Consumers wanted flair, not frugality. They wanted to be seen, not just transported. In the years that followed, Ford tried to keep the Falcon relevant, but was fighting an uphill battle. The company introduced sportier trims like the Falcon Futura, which borrowed some design cues from a Mustang and added chrome accents, bucket seats, and optional V8 engines. These efforts helped for a while, giving the Falcon a touch of personality it had previously lacked. But the problem ran deeper than appearances. The Falcon's reputation as a sensible, economical car, once its greatest strength, was now a liability in a market driven by emotion and image. The Mustang had set a new standard for what a compact car could be, and everything else suddenly seemed dull in comparison. Even Ford's advertising began to struggle with how to present the Falcon. It couldn't compete with the Mustang's youthful glamour or the Fairlane size and comfort. It was, quite literally, the middle child of Ford's lineup. Not big enough to be a family car, not sporty enough to be exciting, not cheap enough to be purely utilitarian. Ironically, while the Falcon's popularity was declining, it remained a crucial part of Ford's engineering ecosystem. The Falcon platform underpinned not only the Mustang, but also the first-generation Ford Ranchero, a car-based pickup that appealed to customers wanting utility without sacrificing comfort. The Falcon chassis even influenced the first generation of the Ford Econoline van, another vehicle that would go on to achieve legendary status in its own right. In that sense, the Falcon became Ford's silent workhorse, a structural and mechanical foundation that supported an entire generation of vehicles. It was the unsung hero behind some of Ford's greatest successes, even if the public no longer noticed. Within Ford's engineering departments, the Falcon was respected and appreciated for its design efficiency, but out in the marketplace, its days in the spotlight were clearly numbered. By the mid-1960s, as the Mustang continued to dominate headlines, the Falcon sales began to decline steadily. Ford refreshed the Falcon styling several times, most notably in 1964 and 1966, giving it more squared-off lines and a slightly sportier appearance, but the changes were incremental. The car's fundamental appeal as an economical, no-nonsense commuter simply didn't resonate in a market that was becoming increasingly driven by emotion and aspiration. Buyers who wanted performance had the Mustang. Those who wanted comfort and prestige had the Fairlane or the Galaxy. The Falcon was caught in the middle, serving customers who were either loyal to its simplicity or couldn't afford to move up market. It still sold in respectable numbers, but had lost the magic it once had. Ford executives recognized this, but saw little they could do without cannibalizing Mustang sales, which were now a goldmine. In a sense, Ford had created its own competition, and the Falcon, the very car that made the Mustang possible, became its first casualty. Still, it would be unfair to say the Falcon failed. Rather, it evolved into something more than itself. Its DNA coursed through Ford's most important vehicles of the 1960s and 1970s. Every Mustang that rolled off the line carried a piece of the Falcon within it. Every Ranchero borrowed its practicality, and every small Ford that followed used lessons learned from its design. Yet, in the public eye, the Falcon was disappearing. Its reputation as a car of simplicity was being overshadowed by the muscle car era, a time when power, performance, and image were everything. It was as though America had outgrown what the Falcon stood for. Where it had once symbolized smart, sensible progress, it now represented restraint in a decade defined by excess. The Falcon had set the stage, played its part perfectly, and then quietly stepped off while the crowd turned its applause toward its successor. Its influence was immense but invisible, woven into the very fabric of Ford's success story. What had started as a humble family car had sparked a revolution, but revolutions have a way of outpacing their origins. And for the Ford Falcon, that was both its triumph and its tragedy. As the 1960s marched forward, the American automotive scene grew increasingly competitive, and Ford found itself facing a crucial dilemma about the future of the Falcon. The compact car that had once symbolized simplicity and sensibility was starting to feel outdated in a market obsessed with style, power, and individuality. By 1965, the Mustang had not only redefined the idea of a compact car, but had become a full-blown cultural phenomenon, and its success cast a long shadow over every other small Ford in the lineup. The Falcon, still dependable and affordable, was slowly losing its sense of identity. Ford executives knew they needed to breathe new life into it, to reimagine what the Falcon could be for a new kind of buyer. Thus came the third-generation Falcon, introduced in the 1966 model year, a car that represented Ford's attempt to modernize the once revolutionary nameplate and adapt it to an era that no longer rewarded modesty. It was sleeker, sharper, and more confident in its styling, but beneath the new sheet metal lay the same question that had haunted the Falcon since the Mustang's debut. Who was it really for? The third-generation Falcon arrived with bold intentions. Its styling was a significant departure from the soft, rounded look of earlier models, adopting the squared-off, muscular design language that had begun to define mid-1960s American cars. It had a more aggressive stance, a wide grille, and a tauter, more sculpted body. Ford wanted it to appear modern and assertive, even if it remained mechanically conservative. The Falcon's new design borrowed cues from the larger Fairlane, giving it a more substantial, grown-up appearance. Ford hoped this would help reposition the car from a basic economy vehicle to something that might appeal to upwardly mobile buyers, people who wanted affordability without the stigma of owning a stripped-down compact. The interiors were improved too, with better materials, more options, and a dash design that looked more contemporary. It was by all accounts the most refined Falcon yet. But even as it looked a part of a modern small car, the Falcon faced an identity crisis it couldn't escape. Under the hood, the Falcon offered a range of engines designed to broaden its appeal. The base model retained the reliable inline-six that had been its backbone since 1960, now enlarged to 170 cubic inches for better performance. For buyers wanting more power, Ford offered the 200 cubic inch 6, or even the small block 289 cubic inch V8, an engine shared with the Mustang and Fairlane. This was a notable step forward. The idea of a V8 powered Falcon was meant to make it seem more spirited, bridging the gap between economy and excitement. However, the Falcon's marketing still leaned on its practicality rather than its performance, which diluted its message. Buyers who wanted real speed bought Mustangs, and those who wanted comfort or luxury looked at a Fairlane or Galaxy. The Falcon's attempt at sportiness felt like borrowed character rather than genuine personality. It had the ingredients for excitement, but lacked the story that made buyers care. Ford was in an awkward position, promoting a car that no longer fit perfectly into any niche. By the late 1960s, the American car market had grown increasingly segmented. The rise of the muscle car, the continuing popularity of mid-sized family sedans, and the introduction of subcompact imports all conspired to make life difficult for Falcon. Compact cars were no longer a novelty. They were expected to be efficient, stylish, and fun to drive. The Chevrolet Nova had reinvented itself as a sporty compact. The Dodge Dart offered bold performance variants, and even AMC had found success with the Rambler American and later the Javelin. Against this backdrop, the Falcon's reputation as a sensible commuter car seemed almost old-fashioned. It wasn't just competing with other brands. It was competing with the cultural shift of an entire generation. The 1960s buyer wasn't interested in a car that symbolized restraint or frugality. This was an era of rebellion, youth culture, and self-expression. A car like the Falcon, which had built its success on modesty and practicality, was simply out of step with the times. Ford's internal structure also contributed to the Falcon's fading role. With the Mustang stealing attention and resources, the Falcon was increasingly treated as a secondary product line. Design and marketing teams were focused on expanding the Mustang lineup with new variants and performance options, while the Falcon's updates were largely incremental. The car still sold reasonably well, but it was no longer a priority. By 1968, The Falcon had settled into a kind of quiet mediocrity, a dependable but unremarkable option in Ford's vast catalog. The sales figures reflected the slow decline. Whereas the Falcon had once topped 400,000 annual sales, by the end of the decade, it struggled to reach half that number. It had become a car people bought out of necessity rather than desire. To Ford's executives, this was both understandable and acceptable. The Falcon's purpose had shifted from being a flagship compact to serving as a budget-friendly alternative that filled gaps in the lineup. Still, it would be unfair to dismiss the late 1960s Falcons as failures. They were good cars, reliable, efficient, and easy to own. The third-generation Falcon, especially in its station wagon and four-door sedan variants, continued to appeal to small families and fleet buyers. Police departments, delivery services, and government agencies often chose Falcons because of their simplicity and low maintenance costs. In these roles, the car's conservative engineering became an asset rather than a liability. It was a dependable workhorse, the kind of car that might not turn heads but could be counted on to start every morning. In fact, many Falcons from this era went on to serve well into the 1970s, quietly performing their duties long after more glamorous cars had been scrapped. But from a marketing standpoint, reliability wasn't enough anymore. The 1960s had taught automakers that emotion sold cars, and emotion was the one thing the Falcon couldn't generate. In a bid to rekindle interest, Ford experimented with sportier trim packages, such as the Falcon Sprint, which featured a V8 engine, bucket seats, and sporty accents. On paper, it sounded like a winning formula, a smaller, lighter car with muscle car performance. But in reality, the Sprint arrived too late and was overshadowed by the Mustang's immense popularity. Buyers who wanted excitement already had a better option sitting in the same showroom. It was a classic case of internal competition. Ford was fighting itself. Every potential Falcon buyer was a Mustang buyer waiting to be convinced otherwise, and Ford had already made the Mustang too irresistible. The Falcon Sprint sold in modest numbers, enough to demonstrate that the Falcon platform could handle performance, but not enough to save the nameplate for its gradual descent into irrelevance. By the end of the decade, the Falcon had become emblematic of a transitional period in American automotive history, a bridge between the humble compacts of the early 1960s and the more ambitious, expressive cars that followed. It had started as a response to foreign competition and economic pragmatism, but as the market evolved, the Falcon's cautious personality no longer aligned with the country's growing appetite for boldness and individuality. The third generation represented Ford's last sincere attempt to give the Falcon a new identity, one that could survive alongside the icons it helped create. But no matter how much Ford dressed it up, the Falcon remained what it had always been, a sensible car in an age that no longer valued sensibility. It had entered the decade as a trendsetter and left it as a relic, outpaced by the very revolution it had helped ignite. In the end, the Falcon's downfall wasn't a failure of engineering or design. It was a failure of timing. It had been the right car for the early 1960s, but by the late decade, America had moved on, and the Falcon, once a symbol of modernity, had quietly become yesterday's news. By the dawn of the 1970s, the Ford Falcon was living on borrowed time. What had once been Ford's proud experiment in compact car practicality had now become a nameplate struggling to justify its own existence. The automotive world had changed dramatically since the Falcon's debut a decade earlier. The American consumer, once drawn to modest, affordable cars in the wake of economic uncertainty, now demanded variety, performance, and individuality, even from budget vehicles. At the same time, new federal regulations concerning safety and emissions were beginning to reshape the very way cars were built. The compact market, once so simple, had fractured into a dozen niches: pony cars, sporty compacts, midsize sedans, personal coupes, and the Falcon, which had once defined the compact class, no longer fit neatly into any category. Ford's own lineup had expanded so rapidly that the Falcon was now surrounded on all sides by competitors from within its own family. Above it were the Maverick and the Fairlane, both more stylish and better marketed. Below it sat the new subcompact Pinto, introduced for the 1971 model year, to compete directly with foreign imports. The Falcon had no clear identity left. It was no longer the new size Ford. It was a forgotten size Ford. By 1970, Ford had made the decision to quietly rebrand the Falcon name rather than reinvent the car. The once proud model was no longer a distinct vehicle, but instead a trim line of the Ford Torino, itself a mid-sized car positioned between the Mustang and the Galaxy. This move symbolized the Falcon's slow descent from innovation to redundancy. The Torino-based Falcon of 1970 shared virtually nothing with the original compact that had debuted 10 years earlier. It was larger, heavier, and entirely disconnected from the spirit that had defined the Falcon name. It existed purely as a low-cost entry in Ford's midsize lineup, offered in limited configurations, and marketed with little enthusiasm. Ford dealerships sold the 1970 Falcon to fleet buyers and budget-conscious customers, but even those sales were dwindling. To the public, the Falcon name no longer meant progress or efficiency. It meant old-fashioned. The car had become an echo of its former self, a once great idea stretched too thin over a decade of shifting market realities. The Falcon's decline was not purely a matter of poor marketing. It was a reflection of broader cultural and industrial change. The late 1960s had ushered in an era of muscle cars, personal luxury coupes, and bold styling, but the early 1970s were defined by something else entirely: regulation and restraint. The U.S. government's new safety and emissions laws, passed in response to growing environmental concerns and consumer protection movements, forced automakers to redesign their vehicles from the ground up. Engines had to burn cleaner, bumpers had to withstand impacts, and crash protection became a legal requirement. These changes added weight, complexity, and cost. Three things the Falcon had always tried to avoid. Its charm had always been its simplicity, its lightness, its affordability. Now, those very traits were impossible to maintain under the new rules. Ford's engineers realized that the Falcon's original unibody platform could no longer be updated to meet future regulations. It was an old design in a new world, and modernization would cost more than starting fresh. In corporate terms, the Falcon had outlived its usefulness. Meanwhile, Ford's new compact car, the Maverick, had stepped into the spotlight. Introduced in 1969 as a 1970 model, the Maverick was everything the Falcon used to be: simple, inexpensive, and efficient, but wrapped in fresher, more youthful styling. Ford openly marketed it as the import fighter, hoping to lure buyers away from the Volkswagen Beetle and Datsun 510. The Maverick's success was immediate, with sales reaching nearly 579,000 units in its first year, numbers that the Falcon hadn't seen since its glory days. It was clear that the Maverick had replaced the Falcon not just in Ford's lineup, but in the public consciousness. The Pinto, introduced a year later, went even smaller and cheaper, targeting buyers who wanted a true subcompact. Between these two new models, the Falcon's purpose had been completely erased. Ford didn't need it anymore, and neither did the market. The Falcon name lingered briefly through 1970 in the United States, largely because it still carried a faint trace of brand recognition. Ford figured there was no harm in squeezing a final year of sales from the badge before retiring it altogether. But this final run was little more than a contractual obligation to the name. There was no dedicated advertising campaign, no new Falcon slogans, no excitement. Most buyers likely didn't even realize that the car still existed, as it was overshadowed by the flashier Mustang Mach-1s and Torino Cobras sharing the same showroom floors. The 1970 Falcon was quietly discontinued after that single model year, with little fanfare. No farewell edition, no press coverage, just an unceremonious disappearance. It was a sad but fitting end for a car that had once captured the American imagination by promising something humble and honest. Now it was gone, replaced by younger models that promised excitement instead of sensibility. Yet, even as it faded from the U.S. market, the Falcon's influence endured behind the scenes. Its engineering legacy remained embedded in the DNA of many Ford vehicles. The Mustang, now an enduring icon, still owed its very existence to the Falcon's platform. The Maverick and Granada that followed both borrowed elements of the Falcon's design philosophy, affordable simplicity, unibody construction, and mass-market appeal. Even the early Ford compact trucks and vans carried echoes of the Falcon's engineering principles. Ford's manufacturing approach, streamlined during the Falcon's heyday, had set the template for efficient production across multiple models. So while the name disappeared from showroom floors, the spirit of the Falcon quietly lived on in the bones of the vehicles that replaced it. It had done its job too well. So well, in fact, that it had made itself obsolete. From a cultural standpoint, the Falcon's disappearance represented the end of an era in American car design. The 1960s have been a time of innovation and rapid change, when automakers weren't afraid to take risks on new concepts. The Falcon had been one of those risks, a bold experiment that redefined what Americans expected from a small car. But by the 1970s, the industry had become more corporate, more regulated, and less willing to take chances on cars that didn't fit neatly into predefined segments. The Falcon's death was part of that transition, a casualty of an automotive landscape that was no longer driven by experimentation, but by efficiency and survival. It had started life as a car for the people, but by the time it ended, it had become a car for no one in particular. For longtime fans, the Falcon's quiet exit was bittersweet. It had been the car that helped Ford recover from financial uncertainty in the late 1950s, the car that paved the way for the Mustang, and the car that proved Americans could love compacts built in Detroit. It deserved more recognition than it got in its final years. Yet perhaps its quiet farewell was appropriate, because the Falcon had never been a car that demanded attention. It had simply earned respect. It wasn't flashy or loud. It was dependable, humble, and dignified to the end. Its disappearance from the American market wasn't a failure, but a natural evolution. The Falcon had fulfilled its purpose, laid the groundwork for what came after, and then bowed out gracefully, leaving behind one of the most understated yet important legacies in Ford's long history. While the Ford Falcon story had reached its quiet conclusion in the United States by 1970, that was far from the end of its global journey. In many ways, the Falcon was just beginning to find its true identity in other parts of the world, particularly in Australia, Argentina, and South Africa. What had become obsolete in North America found a new life elsewhere, reshaped by different needs, markets, and cultures. In these countries, the Falcon wasn't seen as outdated. It was seen as adaptable, the very qualities that made it fade from relevance in the U.S. Its simplicity, strong engineering, and affordability made it the perfect foundation for developing markets and harsh driving conditions. It was in these regions, especially Australia, that the Falcon transformed from a modest American compact into a cultural and automotive icon that would endure for decades longer than its American counterpart ever did. When Ford Australia first introduced the Falcon in 1960, it was marketed as a new kind of car for Australian families, a modern, stylish vehicle with the engineering sophistication of an American car, but small and efficient enough to suit local conditions. However, those conditions were far harsher than anything the original American engineers had anticipated. The unpaved roads, extreme heat, and rugged terrain of the Australian outback quickly exposed the weaknesses of the early U.S.-built Falcons. Suspension components failed, axles bent, and body structures suffered from fatigue. Ford Australia realized almost immediately that if the Falcon were to survive in this environment, it needed to be fundamentally re-engineered for Australian roads. Instead of abandoning the project, Ford took a bold step. They decided to adapt the Falcon specifically for Australia, reinforcing its frame, redesigning its suspension, and strengthening its undercarriage to handle the country's punishing conditions. It was a risky move, but it paid off enormously. What began as a fragile import slowly evolved into a car built by Australians, for Australians. By the mid-1960s, the Australian Falcon had already diverged significantly from its American ancestor. It had a tougher chassis, a stronger differential, and a more robust engine range. Australian engineers had even begun to develop their own body styles and powertrains, creating a car that shared little more than a name with the original. It wasn't long before the Falcon became Ford Australia's flagship model, competing head-to-head with Holden's popular Kingswood and Chrysler's Valiant. Each new generation of Falcon grew more distinctly Australian, reflecting local tastes and culture. By 1966, Ford had introduced the XR Falcon, the first model to offer a V8 engine option, a bold move that redefined the car's image from practical family sedan to performance powerhouse. The XR also gave birth to one of the most legendary variants in Australian motoring history, the Falcon GT, powered by a 289 cubic inch V8. With its muscular stance and racing pedigree, The Falcon GT quickly captured the imagination of enthusiasts and signaled the birth of Australia's muscle car era. The Falcon's transformation from humble compact to high-performance hero reached its zenith in the late 1960s and early 1970s with the release of the Falcon GTHO Grand Touring Handling option. These cars, particularly the Phase 2 and Phase 3 versions based on the XY Falcon of 1971, became legends of Australian automotive folklore. The GTHO Phase 3, powered by a ferocious 351 cubic inch Cleveland V8 engine, was the fastest four-door production car in the world at the time, a claim that no one would dare to associate with the original American Falcon. With a top speed approaching 140 miles per hour, it dominated the racetrack, particularly at the Mount Panorama circuit in Bathurst, where it won multiple times and cemented its place in Australian motorsport history. The Falcon GTHO became a symbol of national pride and performance, a car that proved Australians could not only match American muscle cars, but sometimes surpass them. It was a remarkable transformation. The same nameplate that had once been a modest economy car was now a legend of speed and power. Beyond performance, the Falcon became an integral part of Australian life. It was a car that took families on cross-country road trips, the car of police forces and taxi fleets, the car that could tow a caravan or haul supplies through the outback. It was durable, dependable, and unmistakably local. Over the decades, the Falcon evolved through numerous generations, each reflecting changes in design trends, technology, and consumer needs. The 1970s saw the introduction of the XA, XB, and XE Falcons, which are larger, more aerodynamic, and increasingly distinctive in their styling. The Falcon Coupe of the XB series gained international fame decades later, when it appeared as a pursuit special driven by Mel Gibson in Mad Max, immortalizing the Falcon as a cinematic icon of Australian toughness and rebellion. By the 1980s and 1990s, the Falcon had become a staple of Australian roads, a car that everyone knew, whether they loved it or not. Meanwhile, in other countries like Argentina and South Africa, the Falcon was also experiencing a second life. In Argentina, the Falcon became one of the most recognizable and longest-lived cars in the nation's history. Produced locally from 1962 until 1991, it was used by everyone from government officials to taxi drivers. It became a symbol of reliability and endurance, though its image later grew complicated due to its association with Argentina's military dictatorship, during which the Falcon was infamously used by secret police. Despite this dark chapter, the car's technical legacy remained strong. It was simple, easy to repair, and perfectly suited to the country's roads and economy. In South Africa, the Falcon found a smaller but still loyal following, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s, where it was appreciated for its strength and adaptability. In all these regions, the Falcon story was one of reinvention, molded by the environments and societies that adopted it. Back in Australia, the Falcon continued to evolve long after its American roots were forgotten. Through the 1980s and 1990s, it remained Ford's best-selling car in the country, available in a wide range of configurations, from family sedans and wagons to high-performance XR6 and XR8 variants that kept the spirit of the original GT alive. It became not just a car, but a cultural fixture. Entire generations grew up with Falcons in their driveways, and the car's rivalry with Holden's Commodore defined Australian automotive culture for decades. Bathurst, the country's most prestigious race, became synonymous with the Ford versus Holden battle, a rivalry that fueled fan loyalty and national pride. The Falcon's success made Ford Australia one of the most self-sufficient divisions of the Ford Motor Company, with its own design, engineering, and manufacturing operations. Few could have imagined that a car originally designed for the mild suburbs of America would one day dominate the highways and racetracks of Australia for more than half a century. As the 21st century arrived, the world began to change again. Globalization, environmental concerns, and shifting consumer tastes towards smaller, more efficient vehicles began to undermine the large sedan market that had sustained the Falcon for decades. By the 2010s, SUVs and compact crossovers were replacing traditional family cars. Ford, now operating on a global platform strategy, announced that it would cease Australian manufacturing altogether. In 2016, after 56 continuous years of production, the last Falcon rolled off the assembly line, at Ford's Broadmeadows plant in Victoria. It was an emotional moment, not just for Ford employees, but for the entire nation. The end of the Falcon marked not just the death of a model, but the end of an era in Australian automotive history. Workers wept as the final car, a blue XR6 sedan, was completed, a symbol of pride, resilience, and national craftsmanship. Australia had grown up with the Falcon, and saying goodbye to it was like saying goodbye to a piece of itself. The Falcon story, therefore, is not one of failure, but of transformation and endurance. It began as an American compact designed to meet economic demands and ended as an Australian legend woven into the cultural fabric of a nation. It thrived in places where it had room to evolve, where its simplicity became a strength rather than a weakness. While it died quietly in the United States, the Falcon lived vibrantly elsewhere, changing shape and meaning along the way. It became a family car, a muscle car, a race car, and even a symbol of identity. Its journey across continents is one of the most fascinating chapters in automotive history, a story of adaptability, resilience, and reinvention. The Ford Falcon may have started as a small idea in Detroit, but it became a giant everywhere else, proving that sometimes greatness doesn't come from where a car begins, but from how far it travels. By the time the last Ford Falcon rolled off the assembly line in Broadmeadows, Australia, in October 2016, it marked the end of a legacy that spanned more than half a century and crossed continents. Workers stood in silence as the final car, a blue XR6 sedan, was completed, its engine purring for the last time under the fluorescent lights of a factory that had built millions of Falcons since 1960. There was applause, tears, and a heavy sense of finality. For many of the men and women on that floor, the Falcon wasn't just a product. It was a part of their lives, a symbol of Australian industry, and a source of national pride. The moment carried weight beyond just the closing of a factory. It represented the end of local car manufacturing in Australia, an industry that had once been a cornerstone of the nation's economy and culture. When the last Falcon left the production line, it wasn't just a car that was being retired. It was an identity, a shared memory that had connected generations of Australians through work, family, and passion. What made the Falcon's farewell so profound was the magnitude of its history. When Ford first introduced the Falcon to Australia in 1960, few could have imagined it would endure for 56 years, evolving through dozens of generations, body styles, and engines. Over those decades, it became much more than a means of transportation. It became a fixture of everyday life. For millions of Australians, the Falcon was the car they learned to drive in, the car that took families to the coast for summer holidays, the car that fathers washed in the driveway every Sunday, and the car that roared around Mount Panorama during the Bathurst 1000, battling Holden's Commodores in the greatest automotive rivalry the country had ever known. The Falcon's presence stretched from suburban cul-de-sacs to the red heart of the outback, from police fleets to taxi ranks, from racetracks to high school car parks. It was, in every sense, a people's car, accessible, durable, and deeply familiar. The end of the Falcon was not sudden but gradual, and many saw it coming long before 2016. Globalization and shifting market forces had slowly eroded the foundation upon which cars like the Falcon once thrived. The world had changed, and so had Ford's strategy. Where once Ford operated as a collection of regional divisions building vehicles specifically tailored to local markets, the company had moved toward global platforms, standardized designs shared across continents to reduce costs and increase efficiency. In this new world, there was little room for a car like the Falcon, which was designed and engineered entirely in Australia for Australian conditions. Its large rear-wheel drive layout, once a source of pride, had become a liability in an era that favored smaller, more efficient front-wheel drive cars and SUVs. Consumers no longer wanted big sedans. Families that once would have bought a Falcon were now choosing high-riding crossovers or imported compacts. Even longtime Falcon loyalists found themselves moving on, not because they wanted to, but because the world around them had. Ford Australia fought hard to keep the Falcon relevant in its final decades. The company invested heavily in local design and engineering, creating world-class vehicles that could hold their own against imports. The BA and FG series of the 2000s represented some of the best cars ever built in Australia, combining performance, refinement, and durability in a way that matched global standards. The XR6 Turbo and XR8 models, in particular, became legends among enthusiasts, delivering raw, muscular performance that felt distinctly Australian. These cars were powerful, unapologetic, and proudly homegrown, a last stand to the kind of automotive spirit that defined Australia's car culture. But despite their brilliance, sales continued to decline. The market had moved on. No matter how good the Falcon became, it couldn't escape the reality that fewer people wanted large sedans. The Falcon's DNA, its size, its layout, its purpose, was becoming obsolete in a world of hybrids and hatchbacks. As the end approached, Ford faced an emotional challenge: how to say goodbye to something that had defined both the company and the country for so long. The final generation, the FGX Falcon, launched in 2014, was a respectful farewell, a car that celebrated everything the Falcon had stood for. It featured advanced technology, refined handling, and the most powerful engines ever offered in a production Falcon. The XR8 Sprint, with its supercharged 5.0-liter V8, was a nod to the car's muscle heritage, a last roar before the silence. Collectors and enthusiasts rushed to buy these final models, aware that they were purchasing not just cars, but pieces of history. As production wound down, Ford organized farewell events across Australia, drawing thousands of fans who came to pay tribute. They brought their Falcons, old and new, pristine and battered, lining them up in vast car parks like soldiers in formation. There were tears, laughter, and stories shared of cars that outlasted marriages, jobs, and generations. It was more than a farewell. It was a collective act of remembrance. When the factory doors finally closed, the loss went beyond nostalgia. It represented the end of Australian manufacturing independence. The Falcon had been a symbol of national capability, a car designed, built, and engineered by Australians for Australians. Its disappearance marked a shift toward a future where Australia would no longer make its own cars, instead importing them from overseas. Economically, this was inevitable, but emotionally, it hit hard. Generations of workers had built their lives around the automotive industry, passing down skills and pride from father to son, mother to daughter. The closure of Ford's Broadmeadows and Geelong plants wasn't just about cars. It was about identity, heritage, and the loss of a certain kind of craftsmanship. The Falcon had represented the idea that Australia could stand on its own in the global automotive arena. Its end felt like the closing of a chapter in the nation's story, a moment when something deeply Australian slipped quietly into history. But even in its absence, the Falcon's legacy endures. It lives on in the countless cars still roaming Australian roads, in the racing legends it created, and in the memories of the people who drove, built, and loved it. It remains a staple of classic car shows, restoration projects, and motoring clubs across the country. Enthusiasts continue to celebrate it not out of nostalgia alone, but out of respect for what it represented: ingenuity, resilience, and a uniquely Australian blend of toughness and practicality. Every roar of Falcon GT's V8 at a car meet, every lovingly restored 1970s Falcon coupe gleaming under the sun, keeps the spirit alive. The Falcon didn't just provide transportation. It provided identity. It was woven into the social and emotional fabric of a nation in a way few machines ever are. Looking back, the Falcon's journey is one of remarkable endurance and transformation. It began as a simple idea in Detroit, a small, efficient car to help Americans through economic uncertainty, and became, over the decades, a symbol of strength and pride half a world away. It was proof that a car's story doesn't have to end where it began. The Falcon's adaptability, its ability to evolve and remain relevant for over 5 decades, speaks to something deeper about human ingenuity. It was a car that changed with the times, that grew from humble beginnings into a performance icon, a family favorite, and finally, a national treasure. Its departure from the production line in 2016 didn't erase its influence. It cemented it. The Falcon's legacy lives not in the showrooms or sales charts, but in the hearts of those who knew it, drove it, and believed in it. In the end, the Falcon story is not a tale of decline, but one of evolution, endurance, and dignity. It started as a modest American compact and ended as a cornerstone of Australian culture. It gave birth to legends, carried generations of families, and outlasted its original purpose by decades. Even as Ford moved on to global models and electric vehicles, the spirit of the Falcon remains a benchmark of what it means for a car to belong to a people, to be more than metal and rubber, but a vessel for memories, pride, and national identity. The Falcon may no longer roll off assembly lines, but its essence endures wherever there's a stretch of open road, a growl of a straight six or V8 engine, and someone who remembers what it felt like to drive something that was undeniably and proudly a Falcon.